Tales of the Free Cities, Season 2, The Free Cities Draft.
Episode 7, Farewell. The campfire crackled to itself, bright flames leaping into the air to claw at the night sky. Unlike previous evenings, each of the rookies huddled around the fire in absolute silence, their minds preoccupied with the week ahead. Before they had been able to kid themselves the draft was a while away yet. Now, it was most certainly upon them. Irrefutable and inescapable, the truth bore down upon their shoulders like stone. Every passing moment was suddenly fleeting, all the more precious. There wouldn't be another lazy weekend spent in the academy halls, and these easy-going gatherings would soon be past. After the coming days, there wasn't even a guarantee their paths would cross again, or they'd be able to stay in touch. And worse yet, if they did, it would most likely be as adversaries. And so they remained unspeaking, each locked in personal vigil. At the start they had been strangers, surrounded by untrusted rivals. Over time that had changed. Their shared experience and ordeals had drawn them together in a way more powerful than any would forget for the rest of their lives. This place had forged enmities and friendships, had broken and mended hearts. Divided they had begun, but they had grown united. But everything so far had led to this, a painful dissolution none was ready to acknowledge. A final trial to overcome. Amber sensed a mixture of suppressed emotions in each of them. Nervous anxiety warred with anticipation. Elation contained veins of sadness. They had finally arrived at the end, and it was far more agonizing than they'd expected. With a soft smile, Amber realized this would be the last time they'd all gather together around the fire. The evenings ahead would be busy with guild envoys, officials, packing and travel arrangements. To bid farewell now would almost seem appropriate. The air in this moment was genuine, with no hint of the forced joviality which might follow in later days. She'd much rather not see the memories tainted with something disingenuous. Lane sat on the opposite side of the fire to her. The flames were a physical manifestation of the great barrier which had stood between them since his return, built as much by him as it was by her. Whenever circumstance threatened to have them alone together, he would turn skittish and make his excuses, much to Amber's relief. She suspected probably his too, when she never followed. Shrunken inside his clothes, Lane cut a strange figure next to the others. Tan skin pulled taut over muscle, solid from long days in the field. The rookies were all in prime condition. Their hale appearance only made the lad with the explosion of messy dreadlocks and gaunt stare seem even more out of place. Unexpectedly, he caught her eye and grinned. The expression held a fragile reminder of the smile she remembered from before, rousing a flutter in her chest. She somehow knew what would follow. Breaking the quietude to softly clear his throat, Lane parted his lips and began to sing gently. As the low notes tumbled over each other, rich and warm as the summer sun, it was impossible not to remember the bright core which burned within him. The song was one they all knew, an otherworldly lament for weary soldiers returning from a war. Yet he made it sound more like a celebration of all they had been, and would be forevermore. He was soon joined by Nomad. The raid's fingers plucked at the strings of an old guitar he'd found, and his voice quickly picked up the tune, the clean tone lending a beautiful contrast to Lane's gravel. By the chorus, all of the rookies were humming or singing the words, smiles beginning to break through. Amber felt fingers entwine with hers, and shared a grin with Edge, as the older girls sang along with surprising elegance. At once they were united again, even if just for the evening. Cutlass took a hearty swing from a flask of grog before passing it around, and Knuckles fished out the bag of coins for one last game of dice. Cammy ruffled Flea's hair as the lad excitedly told her about the animals back home and his talks with the world champions. Champ and Gaffer went back and forth on game plans and tactics, Champ drawing lines in the dirt with a stick, while Gaffer stroked his chin thoughtfully. Arms around each other's shoulders, Lane and Nomad launched into another song as soon as the lament ended, this one far more upbeat and with a soaring chorus. Amber's mind went back to the old bridge. The misery she'd previously felt had entirely abated, replaced by contentment. Her past had not been ideal, but it had brought her here, a place she'd grown into a woman far exceeding the understanding of the girl she had been.
What have you got to lose?
Nomad's words from that fateful evening floated up to the surface. She'd known the first part of the answer for weeks, but now realised she had the rest too.
Nothing. I won't ever lose this.
She felt tears making trails over her cheeks, but didn't bother to wipe them away. They could run for all she cared, saluting the happiness she'd resolutely carried to the grave. When eventually he caught up with her, the fire had burned down to all but embers, its glow ebbing away as dawn threatened to break behind the distant tree line. The others had either retired or fallen asleep by now, a handful of slumbering forms cradled by blankets around the site. Amber raised an eyebrow at Knuckles and Edge snuggled together under a sheet, her friend's hand clasping a tattooed arm draped protectively over her. She wondered if the romance had been a long time coming, or was just for the evening. Lane followed her eyes and shrugged. He was right, she realised. It didn't matter. Amber had made a point of speaking with each of the other rookies during the evening. She wanted to fix as many memories of them into her mind as possible, while they were together and happy. Only a couple of them could claim to know which team they'd be heading to at this stage. The others faced anxious days ahead, awaiting contracts and decisions yet to come. Of all of them, Gaffer seemed the most content by far. Rumour had it he was highly sought after by the Blacksmiths Guild, where his extensive knowledge would be put to use training a new generation of apprentices for their fledgling team. Over the last weeks he'd spent hours with their scouts, impressing them with a wide variety of strategies and formation changes. Amber was pleased for him. Assuming another team didn't poach him away, it would be a natural home for his skill set. Nomad wasn't far off the same cool-headedness, still riding the high of being an alchemist's darling since the early days of the draft. Word had reached the academy in the last few days that he'd been replaced by Cammy, but if the news had affected him, Nomad didn't show it. When Amber pressed the subject, he merely shrugged. He'd already known the road in his life. It didn't matter where he might roam. Where he laid his head was home. Champ tried to carry herself with the same indifference, but Amber wasn't the only one who saw straight through the proud turn of her head. She was unsurprisingly the target of several guilds, the butchers, masons, and fishermen among them. Her destiny, along with that of Cammy, Edge, and Lane, was all tied up in a complex struggle of political intrigue and financial wrangling. The situation left their eventual draft order far too close to call. Amber didn't know about Lane, but Edge seemed more excited than nervous, her eyes lit with an unfamiliar fire. Cammy, by comparison, seemed petrified, quickly changing the subject the moment the draft came up. No doubt at least one of her potential teams terrified her, although Amber wouldn't have liked to say which. They'd spent so long immersed in the shadow games that none among their number could be sure of anything anymore. As with Gaffer, Cutlass's downtime had been dominated by visits from one guild alone. With her nautical background, it was no surprise the fishermen had gravitated towards her, although Amber wondered what might happen if the guild decided to draft Cammy instead. The former pirate had seemed far too much of a maverick for most other guilds' tastes, seldom catching their scouts' attention. Strangely, Flea was probably the calmest of all. He'd been the talk of the academy after his friendship with the world champions had been discovered. and enjoyed a surge of popularity among the scouts. It had done wonders for his confidence. That just left Knuckles. Face set in an amused grin, the burly Numasai had only chuckled when Amber danced around the subject of the draft. He knew he wasn't anyone's first choice, but didn't care. Strikers and forward players always drew the most attention, and it would be his pleasure to prove the folly of such short-sightedness next season. Amber herself was one of the lucky few with interest serious enough to scare off any rivals. The excitement of being fought over had been enough to leave her giddy, but it was nothing compared to the day she'd received the envoy from the Farmers Guild. Bushel's words had been true. The world champions did want her. The idea was beyond anything she'd ever dreamed. Even so, her nerves remained frayed. Until the draft itself, anything could happen. Ink had yet to stain paper with her name. All she or any of the other rookies could do was play the hardest they ever had in the final week. The rest was up to the guilds themselves. First, though, there was unfinished business with Lane. In no great rush, they walked back towards the academy hand in hand. This time Amber led, no longer the scared bundle of nerves she had been the first time.
Amber girl.
She stopped and silenced him with a kiss, just an affectionate peck, though she deliberately missed his cheek to brush against his lips. Confusion reigned over his face, until she opened her arms to him. At once relieved, he stepped towards her and rested his head on her shoulder, and she held his frail form close. For the longest time they remained that way, just like before, her shirt stained by his tears, his narrow shoulders racked by the shudders as he cried. It was only now as he let out his grief that she appreciated the supreme effort of will he'd demonstrated all evening. Lane would bear the scars of his struggle for the rest of his life, forever fighting the whisper of his devil. For him, the evening had been a goodbye to more than simply their rookie days. It had been a farewell to a level of companionship he would not look forward to in his forlorn future. Separated from the other rookies, he would need to demonstrate strength and determination which had fled him previously. Her heart broke, not because she was losing him, but because he was losing her. Amber held him tighter as the sun finally broke over the horizon, her fingers stroking his neck. Shank's words floated back through her mind, the drunken slurring as painful to her as it had been then. A person didn't give up because they grew older or became jaded. They gave up because they allowed darkness to creep in. Let every passing moment mean a little less, until there was nothing left of who they had been, or aspired to become. The temptation to drown out the voice of that darkness would always be there. The bottle or worse always waited, especially during the quiet times when a person was alone. Lane had fallen victim to the pressure, and the darkness had nearly consumed him. But if he were going to survive, he'd need to learn how to fight back by himself. She couldn't help him with that, no matter how much she loved him. It was just another reason now was the wrong time for them both. She drew away and looked into his eyes. They were steely grey, more vivid for the pink skin surrounding them, as though the soul were visible behind the vulnerable wall of pained and swollen flesh. Amber saw understanding there. He knew the task ahead, was aware of the challenge. His eyes spoke of bravery and resolve. As the sun began its long climb into the sky, Amber nodded solemnly and gave him one last kiss. Her lips firmly pressed into his, parted slowly, one hand stroking his hair, while the other held his waist. More than anything, she wanted to lead him inside with her. They both knew it could never happen. Eventually they parted, and he offered her his handsome smile one final time, as brilliant as the rising sun. And then he walked away, head held high at last. She watched him until she could bear it no longer, knowing she'd never forget. A smile fought back any hint of bittersweet sorrow. He was going to survive, she was sure. For now she had to concentrate on her own future and claim first place in the draft.
The Free Cities Draft was written by Sherwin Matthews and is the sole property of Steamforge Games Limited. It is reproduced here with their kind permission and their continued support.